I have already spoken to you about the oceanography of this great Mediterranean Sea, and we had a hop, skip, and a jump through the islands the other day. But now I'm going to get down to the more serious troubles that have plagued this sea for all of its written history. Is that someone described the Mediterranean as a sea of war, because for so many millennia there's been a struggle along all of these shores. And part of that's due to its very nature, being surrounded by land and then being essentially a fault line between different cultures and religions, competing empires, and time again they met at sea. Now, I am not a Navy man. I'm a mere merchant marine officer, and we feel we have a mission every day to wage peace and prosperity. So my apologies to our Navy veterans in the audience. I have no stripes to show of veteran experience in the Navy, but I, of course, have a lot of interest in how it has evolved and changed this world where we are today. And the history of warfare in the Mediterranean is really an evolution of marine technology and also, in a certain sense, our cultural development over so many centuries. And so I'm going to give you just a taste of some of the great battles and some of the contexts that lead us to our peaceful time we have today. Now, the first images of vessels in this area were, of course, in Egypt, but they were usually just on the Nile. Some went down the Red Sea. We don't have any record or imagery of great sea battles in the Mediterranean by the Egyptians, but there were certainly the Phoenicians, who were, of course, up in Sidon and Tyre in that area, and they created a great trading empire all the way along the coast of the southern coast of the Mediterranean. And certainly by this depiction, they took warriors with them to make sure that the locals were willing to trade with them. And the Phoenicians set up the trading centers at the good harbors and shores that then became the Carthaginian Empire, and then the cities and harbors that we know today, all the way to Tripoli. And they also went to Sicily, Sardinia. So that was perhaps the first empire of the sea in the Mediterranean. There is reference by the Phoenicians and the Egyptians to previous sea people. There is a special hieroglyphic that looked like a sail, which referred to the aboriginal peoples that lived in the sea. And they may have been living on those islands that I showed the other day who built stone temples and dolmens and imagery that remains to this day, that we have no historic record of them. So even in prehistoric time, there was undoubtedly struggle across these seas in boats like this. Now, this is off of a Grecian urn, which shows a simple galley, a boarding ladder, a square-rigged sail, and then the crew, and particularly the ram in the front of the vessel. Now, this became the classic galley of the Mediterranean, and from its various early development along the shores of probably the Levant, Palestine area, or Egypt, it then spread as a technology up to Greece and across the sea and became the main fighting vessel throughout the Mediterranean. It grew in size and in also the number of rowers, oarsmen who would propel this. When there was a good wind at the right time, they would sail, but there was often a great complement of often slaves that would then be the propelling force to get across calm seas or to especially engage in battle. So here's a model of a later Grecian model of this galley. The biggest became the triremes, with a 3-layer galley with rowers on these different levels that could be very well coordinated to turn the ship, and they were quite agile when they were properly commanded. Later times they had freemen. For instance, the Venetians had citizens who would man them for the most effective naval operations, rather than depending on slaves who had to be mistreated to work so hard. In Piraeus, there's a reconstruction of one of these galleys, which shows how they were the different layers, but the lowest layer had these leather sleeves because those oars were almost at the waterline, and that kept the wave splash out of the vessel itself at the time. Here's that great trireme that is in Piraeus, and you can see that it has the classic eye, the evil eye in the Mediterranean. You see that all through Mediterranean to give good luck to a ship, and supposedly so the ship can see where it's going in case the helmsman is asleep at the wheel. But you have also a great bronze, what's called the ram or the rostrum. Actually, this device right here is called rostrum after that. Not that I'm going to ram anybody, but it is, on the ship it was a specially built prow ram that would puncture the hull of another vessel, and then it had that kind of a rail on it so that it could also withdraw. So after the ramming was done, they'd back the oars and they could pull out without getting caught in the other vessel, or else they would board and have hand-to-hand combat. Now, when these things were up and running, either by sail or by oar, they must have been a tremendous sight, especially as they built many, many of them. Some of these fleets were hundreds of these vessels of various sizes, and this galley warfare developed over centuries to be the biggest naval battles ever seen in antiquity were certainly in parts of especially the Aegean. Here's a Greek vessel out underway, and I think you can get a lot of exercise in that rowing machine. Now, the Aegean, especially because of its contained nature, all of its different islands, and then the land bridge between Asia and Europe, became a center of great conflict. All these different empires came and went over the Bosphorus and then down into the Greek Isles. And so there's uncountable number of battles that happened. There's a few major ones that we all know about. Most famously, the face that launched 1,000 ships of Helena of Troy, who, you know the tale, she went off with Prius and went to Troy, and then Agamemnon and the rest of them went and took their vast fleet all the way over to Troy and had the great battle. Now, you've seen the movie, which has remarkable footage of the fleet crossing over to Troy, and then, of course, the Trojan horse solved the siege, and then Troy was destroyed. But without the naval capability, that siege never would have happened. They were resupplied, and the Greeks on the shore had the upper hand eventually just because they could stay there and then go back home seasonally. That lasted some 10 years. This was a model for many other sieges of cities in the Mediterranean. And an island like Rhodes, which had the great Lighthouse, one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world, would be a fortified port with fortresses, and then if there was ever an enemy attack, they could defend themselves from siege and also close the harbor with chains and other obstructions. I heard that the island of Rhodes is planning to rebuild this as a great attraction, but I believe it'll be made out of styrofoam. Then the Greeks, of course, had a life and death struggle with the Persians, and in the great battle of Thermopylae and Marathon led to the final naval engagement at Salamis, which is the island right near Athens. Some of us went to Corinth, went right past it, and it's an island sitting in the Bay of Saron, and King Xerxes sat on his throne and watched his fleet come around and then try to bottle up the Greeks. The Persian fleet was far more numerous, a few hundred of galleys attacking a lesser Greek force, but the Greeks feigned a retreat up into the backwaters, and the Persians, impatient to defeat them, went into the constricted waters. Then the more agile Greek triremes, galleys, got around and then made a great battle with the Persians and boarded them, and then it became the one naval victory that then ensured that the Persian Empire was defeated, and Greece would, of course, become going into its golden age. And then itself became an empire. Here is later 1413, just a generation after Salamis. The Greeks then were expanding and attacked Syracuse, which was an independent city. It was Etruscan originally, but the Greeks came into that harbor and they were caught by the Syracusans into the harbor, and they had a great battle right there. It was said by Thucydides that there was never a battle with so many ships in such a small place, such that the Athenians, Greeks, were driven ashore where they had to go and have hand-to-hand combat on the beach, and they were all decimated or else enslaved. Now, that was one of the defeats of Greece, but later glory came with Alexander as he marched to the east, and he came by sea and laid siege to the former Phoenician city of Tyre. And again, there was a great battle on the shores, and finally Alexander was victorious, primarily because he would also use a thing called Greek fire, which was an incendiary device. Now Alexander planned to build a bridge over so he could land troops that could then storm the walls of Tyre, and this was again a great triumph for the empire at the time. Later, the Romans adopted the Greek fleets in the style of their construction. Though the Roman legions were, of course, a land-based force, and they were not really marines, so the Romans built larger galleys so they could have a full, heavy legion on board with all of their armor and their assorted war-making devices. And in the First and Second Punic Wars against Carthage, they were facing an enemy descended from the Phoenicians that had a more nimble naval fleet. But the Romans then got an advantage because they built a device called a corvus, which is a landing bridge that would drop from the mast down onto a enemy ship and then allow their legionnaires to march on just like they did at land and into that kind of impenetrable formation, take over the ship. And by that technique, they were able to eventually beat the Carthaginians twice. Now, Carthage, of course, was this vast empire that was along the southern shore of the Mediterranean. But when the Roman navy had taken superiority at sea, that's why Hannibal had to go by land, crossing over into what is now Spain and marching all the way over the Alps to attack Rome from its northern borders. And of course, he didn't win. But this was a great struggle. There were many battles. But I found this illustration from the Battle of Drapana, which is a peninsula off of Sicily, when Publius Claudius, the admiral of the Roman navy, asked the flagship priest for an omen of the battle. And traditionally, the Romans would have chickens in cages, and they would feed the chickens just before the battle was to be engaged. And if they ate with appetite, that meant they would be victorious. But if the chickens didn't eat the grain, then it was a bad sign that they should not engage battle. But Claudius was so arrogant, he said, well, if they won't eat, maybe they'll drink, and he had them thrown into the water. And Cicero wrote that by his arrogance, he angered the gods, and he was defeated by the Carthaginians, who got around and then forced the Romans onto the beach and wrecked their ships. So that's the way navies used to tell what they were doing. Later at Actium, this is off the Peloponnese western coast of what now Greece, the great battle between Octavian and Mark Antony coming up from Egypt with the fleet was engaged to see who would be the winner of essentially the Roman Civil War. And in this somewhat fanciful view, Octavius defeated Mark Antony, and supposedly this is Cleopatra, who came along just to watch the action, is getting away back to Egypt. This is, of course, a later fantasy view of it, but I love the various swans and eagles and the most curious version of the vessels at that time. It looks like a ride at Disneyland. It may be someday. But the Romans, when they had established naval superiority over the Mediterranean, they would mint coins that showed their war galleys and their great admirals. And of course, they went all the way around, not by sea, but then they took some galleys and rebuilt them up in the north coast of Europe and invaded Britain. So this naval empire extended all the way to the North Sea. The Greeks, though, I mentioned they had this device they called Greek fire. Later in the Byzantine time, they perfected this where they could pump sort of a napalm onto a neighboring vessel. And this kept any pirates and invaders well at bay for many centuries. And to this day, they still don't know the formula of how they could take some sort of highly flammable liquid, probably, and then able to spew it onto another ship. Sounds like a very dangerous thing to have on a vessel, and I'm sure it's not allowed on this ship. Well, the castles that were built along all the shores of the Mediterranean were trying to defend against sieges, pirates, and the other perils that came across the sea. This is Bodrum, which is a very large crusader castle on the Anatolian coast of Turkey, and it's still well preserved to this day. At the time, Christendom was supposedly united to go take back Jerusalem, and there was all these different crusades that happened. During the Fourth Crusade, which was quite a disaster, the Venetians were contracted by the Pope, to convey the united armies back to retake Jerusalem. But because there wasn't payment made in time, the Venetians decided to turn their fleet, and then they went and sacked Constantinople instead. And this is illustrative of how the Venetians were considered to be very suspect by the more righteous Romans, or particularly the papal states. And the Venetians had the answer that we must always be ready to treat our enemies as friends and be most careful with our friends. And this played itself out over and over again in other battles where Rome or Spain and Venice tried to unite against the forces, particularly of the Ottomans, and they would have dissent. They would start fighting with each other, and often the Turks would say, if the Christians can't agree, we will certainly conquer them with no problem. Now the galleys, though, were still the main battleships of this era, and they just got larger and larger with hundreds of men on board. And this was a reason for slavery that continued all through the Mediterranean. And naval galleys would go out on raids just to collect enough men to man their vessels. If they were short-manned, they would lose the next battle. And so this became a archetypical cruelty of the sea. You all remember the scene in Ben-Hur where Ben-Hur was being beaten as the galley slave, and the phrase at the time was, "We keep you alive to serve the ship." And so this was a cruel time where both sides would go raid and capture slaves. So the Islamic forces would have Christian slaves, and the Christians would take Islamic slaves to man their ships. But there were many hundreds of thousands of Europeans taken to the south coast of Africa to be sold into galley service or other services in the various Barbary states in the Ottoman Empire. Here's a view of Algiers with some what they would call white slaves being delivered, and there were so many captured at different times that at one point a Christian slave could be bought for one onion. And now here's an example of another slave that was brought. I think she's worth at least 2 onions, if I had the onions to pay for. But the courts of, particularly the Ottoman Empire, starting in the 1100s on until they finally were over in the early 1900s, after World War I, this was a slave-based society. And for instance, as Christine Russell was saying, all of the harem women were slaves that were captured, so they weren't good Islamic women. And then the succession politics of the Ottoman Empire was that all of the potential heirs would be killed, and the one that survived would become the next sultan. And he was then served by black slave eunuchs who then ran the court. So, and then the Ottoman Empire also had a modus operandi to always go and conquer more territory so that they could have enough lucre and reward to keep the Janissaries and the other crack troops well paid off. Now this was a formula for instability at its best, but especially it created a great deal of terror. And the Ottomans were very pronounced that they were going to conquer the rest of the world. And one of the Sultan's advisors, he quoted the Book of Predictions in the Quran saying that we will conquer the world and it will be by sea. And so the Ottomans put a great deal of investment into their galleys and their naval forces. And especially when Suleiman ascended as the Sultan, he emphasized naval construction because he had already conquered Hungary and Eastern Europe to the gates of Vienna, but he wanted to go and eventually take Rome. And it was written at the time that Turkish expansion is like the sea. It never has peace, but it always rolls. And so he built the largest navy of the time and then had the famous Barbarossa brothers lead his expeditions. Now there was an older brother, Ulrich Barbarossa, who was captured and killed at a battle off of Italy, but his brother, the younger Barbarossa, the more famous, was the great terror of the sea. The Christians at the time called him the king of evil because he was so cunning and merciless that he would attack and sack and then torture. As it was written, the very mention of the Turks is so horrifying that it makes Christians lose not only their strength and their courage, but also their wits. And it was said that the Turks considered cruel to be a great virtue. And this was a cruel time when even the Christians were cruel to others and themselves. But the Ottoman Empire was almost a bureaucratic form of torture and rack and ruin that they would visit upon a lot of the coast all the way to Spain. They would raid, take slaves, sack cities, and this was meant the Mediterranean was a very dangerous place because of these kind of vessels. These are the corsairs, they were called, which were very fast. They had very good sailing abilities, and they had troops on board that would land and raid. Now, at the time, France and Spain were competing, and the French Valois, Francois I, allied with Barbarossa and the Turks to limit the Spanish Habsburg rule over the Western Mediterranean. They were fighting over various parts of Italy and the coasts, and so Francois I allowed Barbarossa to come and make a base at the French city of Toulon and then be provided with provisions which the local people had to pay for, and the Catholic Cathedral of Toulon at the time was turned into a mosque. Well, this then became a base for further attacks against the Spanish, and Charles V, the Habsburg young emperor at the time, was determined to fight back, and so he built his own galleys, mostly in Barcelona, and he went on the offensive to try to catch Barbarossa. He attacked Algiers and Tunis. He was successful to invade and destroy Tunis, but he was turned back at Algiers. And then another battle, Barbarossa took the Spanish fleet and destroyed it at Preveza, which is near Genoa. Now this meant that the Christians were very disunified, and they were very much threatened. They really thought that the Turks, the Ottomans, would eventually take over. Barbarossa laid a siege on Nice, which was allied to Spain at the time, and destroyed that smaller town, and then took Crete. Here's an example of the hope that the grace of God will save Crete and other Christian islands from the Ottomans, but they continued to expand their strength in what was called the White Sea to the Turks. The Venetians were right in the middle of this, and they had actually trading agreements with the Ottomans so that they could go to Egypt and the Levant and be the middlemen of the spice trade, the silk trade, things like this. And again, that was very hard for the Venetians to make peace. But the Knights of St. John's, who were the leftovers of the Crusaders, had some fortresses in Turkey and the Isle of Rhodes, and then eventually Malta. There was a siege led by Suleiman of the Ottoman Empire against Rhodes, which was not that far from Istanbul. But the knights were let safe passage to surrender, and then they went to Malta. And this then led to the Great Siege of Malta a few years later, 1565. And a very vast fleet of hundreds of galleys came down the Bosphorus from Istanbul and then surrounded this island. It was called the Ravelin of Christianity, meaning the outward flank. And it was believed by both sides at the time that if Malta could be taken, then it would be a short work to get to Rome and conquer Rome and Italy for the Ottoman Empire. And so at this time, before the siege, Erasmus wrote, the rumor here is, but is public knowledge, is that the Turk will invade Italy and Germany with all his forces and do battle for the great prize, whether Charles or Suleiman will be the monarch of the entire globe, for the world cannot any longer bear to have two suns in the sky. And then he was answered by the great vizier Ibrahim Pasha in Istanbul, who said, just as there is only one God in heaven, there can only be one empire on earth. And Spain is like a lizard, pecking here and there at a bit of weed, while our great sultan is like a dragon which gulps down the world when it opens its mouth. And so Malta was attacked, but it was defended by the Knights of St. John and their great leader, Jean de la Valette, the French knight, after whom the harbor is named now. And he held out by high discipline and then some assistance from the Maltese people who had a guerrilla campaign against the encampment of the Ottomans. The Ottomans and the Turks and their allies greatly outnumbered the defenders of Malta, and it was almost lost. And only by a few ruses did the Turks finally withdraw, mainly because the weather turned on them and it was going to be winter, and they eventually left and Malta was saved, but only after tens of thousands of men and women and children were slaughtered in these great battles on the heights above the old town of Malta. And so that failure to conquer Malta meant that for the time being, the Ottoman Empire was at bay, but the threat was still there, and both sides, having had this great battle at Malta, rearmed and gathered ever larger forces. And then the Pope Pius V called a Holy League, and he finally got the Venetians, the Habsburgs, and the French to unite to send a combined fleet to meet the Ottomans for a final showdown at sea. And they were led by Don Juan of Austria, who was a 26-year-old heir to the throne, son of Philip II of Spain, who was a very dynamic young man who did not want to listen to caution. He wanted to go and find them and to rout the Turkish fleet. And so he took the combined fleet to the western coast of the Peloponnese and the Ionian Sea, where the Ottoman fleet had been taking harborage in the Gulf of Lepanto. And he bottled them up. Don Juan put his fleet at the entrance to this very narrow passage, which is by the Gulf of Corinth. Here's an illustration of the time where the Turkish fleet could have just sat them out until they left because they didn't have enough provisions. There was a discussion among the different commanders of the Christian fleet that if they had to wait too long, then they wanted to go back to Venice and get more supplies, or they would go raiding in different places. But Don Juan said, no, wait till they come. They will inevitably come out to attack us because they can't wait either. They don't want to be stuck up all winter. And so finally the Turkish fleet under Ali Pasha came out of the bay, and he was met by this great wall. There was about 200 some major vessels on each side, one of the largest fleets ever gathered until later great battles of World War II. But the League forces had a vessel called a Galleys, which was a Venetian construction of a very large heavy galley with 4 batteries, very heavy artillery on the 4. So as the Ottoman fleet came out, these great cannon decimated much of their fleet as they came to engage and do hand-to-hand boarding and combat. And at this time it was called the Sea of Fire. When the formation started to break up and individual ships got engaged, then there was a tremendous battle of thousands and thousands. Galleys were rammed, bombed. The fire and musketry was somewhat new compared to the ancient times. And some writers have described this as the one battle where Bronze Age savagery, hand-to-hand chopping and hacking, was combined with modern artillery and gunpowder incendiaries, such that it created the greatest loss of life in the shortest time of any sea battle to date. There were some 40,000 men that were killed in 4 hours, and most of the Ottoman fleet was destroyed. Well, here's a couple of close-ups of paintings that are in Venice of the great victory of the destruction of the Turkish fleet. Here's a modern rendition of one of the flagships, of the lantern ships they call them, because they had signaling lanterns on the stern. And one by one they were either destroyed or they were victorious. At the end of the battle, when it was realized that the Ottomans had been decisively defeated, there was this illustration published which shows Pope Pius gathering like a big net all of the infidels to dispose of them. And one of the Ottoman chroniclers, Pachevi, he wrote, I saw the wretched place where the battle took place myself, and there's never been such a disastrous war in an Islamic land, nor all the seas of the earth since Noah created ships. 180 vessels fell into enemy hands or were destroyed, along with all of their armaments, the galley slaves, and many warriors. And all of this is a great disaster for the Caliphate of the Ottoman Empire. And Cervantes, the great Spanish writer, who was a warrior at the time and wounded, he said it was the greatest event witnessed by ages past, present, and to come. And this particular victory for the Holy League set the political geography of the Mediterranean to this day, where Istanbul, then down to the south of Malta all the way to Morocco is still Islamic, and north of that it is still token Christian. So it's been called by some historians the Trafalgar victory of Christian Europe at the time that then set us up for our modern age. Now, the Ottomans were still a very strong force and a very wealthy empire and had a lot of provinces, and they continued to try to hold their own, even though they continued to be under attack slowly but surely. In this case, the Russians attacked the Turkish fleet. They came all the way around from St. Petersburg in the Baltic all the way up the Mediterranean to have a battle at Chesma near this another island in the Aegean. And this further weakened the Ottomans. But the main change that happened is those galleys, which were fairly fragile compared to ocean-going frigates and the large ships of the line that were being built, especially in England and by the Western powers, became the dominant marine technology thereafter. So these large sail vessels that had such tremendous sailing capability at sea replaced the galley-drawn ships that were only really effective in calmer, more constricted waters. The last galley was used in 1801 at the Battle of Copenhagen, but that was because it was a local boat in the waters around Copenhagen. But this became the standard, a multi-masted tall ship with greater sails. And so this developed to the point where you have the great HMS Victory with its very complex sail pattern meant that these ships, if they were handled and commanded properly, could maneuver well, and then with their tremendous amount of artillery could defeat any smaller vessel or bombard shore forts and thereby have superiority in naval combat. And so if you can see in these great paintings by Turner of some of these ships of the line, which at the top of the fleet were these vessels that had tremendous decks and large masses of artillery. There's up to over 100 on the major ships. And then the smaller ships were used for scouting and for getting supplies or harassing the enemy. But whenever these ships of the line would come in, they were the great dreadnoughts of their time. Here's the Victory as it is preserved. You can see how powerful those cannons can be, and you've seen all the movies. And also you may have seen how difficult life was down below in the cramped quarters. This is not a picture from down below the crew quarters here. This is the Victory. And they had, just like the galleys though, they had a very hard time manning these ships because they were such hard labor, so dangerous that famously in England they had press gangs that would go and they'd rake the bars and essentially have enslaved labor, but they would get a reward. And here's a cartoon of the era which before Trafalgar, which says equity or a sailor's prayer before battle. And I don't know if you can read it, but the officer's saying, "Are you praying for victory and God's deliverance?" And the sailor's saying, "No, I'm just praying that just like the prize money is divided, we hope that the blows of the enemy go more to the officers than to the men." And so there was a real problem with insubordination, and you know all the stories of the cat o' nine tails and the flogging and all the terror of the sea to work on it. But nonetheless, of course, the English forces came and had a superiority all through the Mediterranean for quite a while after this particular victory at Malaga, where the Dutch and English fleet defeated a Spanish-French force and took the great rock of Gibraltar, where we will be passing soon. And this redoubt at the gate of the Mediterranean meant a great strategic advantage for all the centuries subsequently. And even though this was won at some great loss of life, and the Spanish government still does not recognize the victory or the right of Britain to have the rock, it is still one of the keys to the naval control of the Mediterranean. And any of you who have been there, it's a great and historic place to this day. It still is a strategic, had great strategic importance even now in a different era. Well, when the English forces were at Gibraltar, they then made further bases down in the Mediterranean, all the way finally to Alexandria, Egypt. But a major base was at Majorca, and the French attacked and then drove the British out briefly in 1756. And the admiral of the fleet at the time, an Admiral Byng, if you've heard of him, he was accused of not being aggressive enough, and he was then court-martialed for not performing his duty, and he was executed on his own flagship. This was somewhat of a famous and embarrassing moment in British naval history, and famously Voltaire wrote at the time, England is a country in which it is wise at time to kill an admiral, so to encourage the others. Well, other heroes came along who were a little made of sterner stuff, and of course you know our fellow friend here, Horatio, who then became the great leading admiral of his age, and he won many great commendations. The Crescent of Turkey and the King of Sicily gave him this, and he had a ceremonial decoration on his hat. And of course, as you know, he wore this at the Battle of Trafalgar so that the snipers could easily see him. And of course, he was felled in the beginning of the battle and became a great martyr to his own legend. But when he was a junior officer in the Mediterranean, he was based in Sicily, and then at the time, England and Great Britain were allied with the King of Sicily versus the French forces that had conquered the west coast of Italy. And there was a big battle for Naples. The local peoples had a revolt against French troops that were stationed in Naples. Nelson was encouraged by his friend Emma Hamilton to go in and rout the French, who at the time imprisoned a bunch of the Neapolitans. And the leader of the uprising, though, was charged with treason to the Kingdom of Sicily, where he was supposedly had his allegiance, but he was trying to establish his own republic. So he was summarily court-martialed on Nelson's ship and hung and dropped into the water. And this is a view of the Carraccio is his name, and this painting shows that his body floating by. This was an embarrassment to Nelson at the time, but shortly thereafter, a couple of years later, he went down to meet the French fleet, which was there as part of Napoleon's expeditionary force in Egypt. And this was a great setup for a naval battle because the French fleet was arrayed in Aboukir Bay, which was they came from Toulon all the way down to Egypt, and then they anchored off and dropped off the French troops. And this set up the Battle of the Nile in 1798. Now this was, again, a great array of all the ships of the line. By this time there were no galleys in these fleets, so they had very careful line formations. The usual battle was where they would line up and bombard each other till enough were disabled that they would yield and give over their prize to the enemy. But in this case, the British had by this time developed a new naval tactic, actually written about by a clerk in Scotland who, reading the naval history, he was not a Navy man, his name was John Elgin, and he recommended that the Royal Navy be more aggressive and not just sit and be bombarded, but to go in and break up formations, cut the line, and then have ship-on-ship combat that then they could be more victorious. And this is what Nelson adopted along with Admiral Rodney at the Battle of Les Sons off of Guadeloupe. And then this was very effective at the Battle of the Nile because the British fleet came in, essentially surrounded the French line, and then picked them off one by one in a great array of individual initiative that was given by Nelson to his individual ship captains. As Nelson said, Bonaparte had never yet to have an encounter with an English officer, and I shall endeavor to make him respect us. And that he did, because the French fleet was completely decimated in the great bombardment, the breakup of the line, the individual battles, and hand-to-hand combat that finally created the great melee. And then the flagship of the French fleet, L'Orient, with the Admiral Bruce on board, exploded in a great catastrophe for the French fleet, because once the flagship was gone, then the rest of them scattered or were taken as prizes. And so this is one of the paintings of the great battle with the French, who were completely routed at this point. But there was a commander on the L'Orient, his name was Casabianca, who was wounded on deck, and he was urged to go below to see the surgeon, and he refused, saying, "A French admiral shall die on his quarterdeck." And he did when the ship blew up. But before it blew up, he had his son with him who was 10 years old, who stood by his father as he was dying on deck. And as a poem was written later, the boy stood on the burning deck whence all but he had fled. Beautiful and bright he stood, a proud though childlike form. The noblest thing that perished there was that very young and faithful heart. Well, when the battle was over, Nelson, of course, was greatly celebrated and became the greatest naval commander of his time and went on to Trafalgar. Here in this cartoon, it's said that he's bringing back a couple of crocodiles from Egypt to give to the king. And his ability to command his fleet and to innerviate his own commanders was quite famous. And the American admiral, who was a historian and taught at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, described that the proceedings of the British fleet under Nelson show an instructive combination of rapidity and caution, of quick capitulation of comprehension of the situation with an absence of all precipitation, no haste incompatible with perfect carefulness, nor time lost either by hesitation or by preparations postponed. And he called this as an instinct par non in naval warfare. And of course, this is an example to this day. Well, nonetheless, the south coast of the Mediterranean was still hostile to European forces of any kind. And the Barbary pirates, as they have been dubbed, had their different sultanates and pashas all along this coast. And there was a whole period where European shipping would be preyed upon by pirates. And they would come out of the coasts in quicker corsairs and capture vessels, and then they would usually be paid a ransom. And most of the European merchants would keep up a pool just to pay them off, buy back the slaves, and so this was a plague of the Mediterranean for quite a while. But then that young upstart country called the United States refused to pay, and when some American ships were captured, President John Adams sent this officer, Bainbridge, on a ship to pay tribute to and make peace with the Dey at Tripoli. And he was quickly ordered that his own ship had to be used as transport to Istanbul to pay tribute there. Well, this was taken the wrong way, and it led to the conflict with the Barbary pirates. This ship, the Philadelphia, had been chasing some of them and ran aground, and then was going to be taken by the Barbary pirates as a prize, but then the young officer, Stephen Decatur, led a mission onto it. Then they set a charge and it blew it up there in Tripoli harbor. Then they came in with the rest of their fleet, which was not that large, about 3 frigates, and began to bombard the town, and then stormed the town with the Marines, had hand-to-hand combat, and won the day and subdued these pirates for the time being. This was lauded by Nelson especially, that this was a very brave act, rather than just paying off the pirates, to actually go out and clear out their lair, which is perhaps an example of what could be done these days. Well, it didn't work for very long, because as soon as the fleet left, then the Barbary coast was again dangerous, and the Marines had to go back in again and storm Tripoli 10 years later. And then it became a refrain in the U.S. Marine song, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." And so, unfortunately, the problem sort of continues on in different places. But for the Mediterranean, the next great battle was at Navarino, which was where the combined British and Russian fleet battled the Ottoman and Egyptian fleet, who were trying to suppress the Greek uprising. And this was part of the effort to free Greece from Ottoman rule. And the Ottoman fleet, Egyptian fleet, were caught in this bay of a Greek island and were destroyed utterly. This was the last great time that the Ottomans ever had a battle with a larger fleet, but they were defeated at that point, and of course Greece became an independent and a Christian nation again. Now, battles continued on, though, amongst the European powers. Here's one between the Russians and the Italians at Lissa in 1866. It was the last of a wooden ship ramming what happens to be an ironclad. And then ships continued on. They became dreadnoughts. This is a painting by an artist, Ian Hamilton, who was a specialist in painting the great battleships of the era. They're quite evocative, particularly since they're at anchor and they're having a shore day. But of course, World War I loomed, and the gap between the Black Sea and the Aegean was the site of the great Battle of Gallipoli, which was, of course, not a success. And you know the story. The fleet came up trying to land and make way through the Ottoman land to provide supplies to Russia and the rest of the European campaign. The Australian and New Zealand troops were landed, but the Allied fleet was destroyed by mines and couldn't get through. And then it became mayhem along the beach and was a great defeat. And so many thousands died. There's a great memorial there if you've been there. And Ataturk, he has an inscription there said, "We understand how painful it is to lose your sons, but since they died on our land, we shall treat them like our own with honor." Warfare continued to be mechanized, industrialized, and became ever more dangerous with bigger guns, battleships. Here's a Greek Navy ship named after the Battle of Salamis, U-boats. In World War II, the French fleet was at anchor here in Merzat Kabir and also in Toulon, and the Allies demanded that they give it over to either British control or go to a third party and not join the Nazi forces or the Italians. And the force at Merzat Kabir was bombed by Royal Navy and lost about 1,300 French sailors, and then the Toulon fleet was scuttled. And that was important because had those ships joined the Axis side, they probably would have tilted the balance of battle over the Mediterranean World War II and not led to the invasion into the softer underbelly of Europe that led to the Allied victory. Well, I'm going to come to the end here with just what's happened and since. Now, the Cold War had considerable fleets in the Mediterranean, but fortunately there was no battle, and it has been left to NATO forces to control these waters or keep them peaceful. Here's this U.S. frigate named after that commander at Tripoli. And then there are the great behemoths of our own age, which are, of course, based on aviation and missilery. And there's a whole stealth fleet that lurks around the Mediterranean. But the only recent naval engagement has been actually in the 6 Days War, where a Russian-made Styx missile from an Egyptian patrol boat sank an Israeli vessel, the Iliad, in that war. That's the last battle of the Mediterranean. There have been some other troubles since, for instance, the bombing of the Cole, which was actually down in Aden. But what we have today is a highly navalized Mediterranean and, of course, Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean also. Though the Indian Ocean, curiously, has had very few major naval battles in its history, maybe because it's so big and open, it doesn't compress the contradictions of society and culture. But I'm going to show you a last picture, which is a ceremony where U.S. Marines are giving some of our Arab allies what is called the Marmaluke Sword, which were the captured swords of Turks back in the battles with the Ottoman Empire. And as a custom, the U.S. Marines present these to their own allies, which is somewhat ironic. Here's an Islamic-style sword being presented to our new Islamic allies in the current difficulties of the world. So you can appreciate for the length of time it's taken to cover all of these difficulties of this great sea, which fortunately at our time is now at peace. And where, even though there's Navy out there and there's some proposals to make the Mediterranean a sea of peace with no nuclear weapons, a limited Navy, open passage, and hopefully that'll guarantee all of these troubles of the past will not be visited upon us. And especially the proposal that Turkey join the EU is a remarkable change from the battles that went on for centuries between the Islamic world and Europe for so long. And hopefully this will be our future. With that, thank you very much, and I hope to live with you in peace. Thank you.